Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the fourth installment of Vote Common Good's webinar series on the threat of Christian nationalism, a faithful response. For the last 4 weeks, we have been asking content professionals, people who understand the power of Christian nationalism, to help all of us understand it and where its power lies. And we've asked practitioners to give each of us some steps forward, some ways that we could move forward in our culture, in our society, in our faith communities, in our friendships, in our families, for how we can respond to these issues. So we're really glad that you're with us tonight. As in previous weeks, I'm one of your co-hosts, Doug Pagitt, here with Stephany Spaulding. Hello, Stephany. And of course, Christy Berghoef. Hi, Christy. And tonight we are joined by Kristin DuMez. Kristin is the author of the book Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation, what I have long referred to as the greatest subtitle in a book I have ever read. So we can talk more about that in a bit. Kristin is also a history professor at Calvin College. So she's going to be our guest. We're also going to hear from Shane Claiborne here in a little while tonight with some responses. And if you're in the Zoom webinar, we'd also love to hear from you. So there's a chat room there. There's a place for you to put your comments and your questions. And we'll also have a time after both our conversation with Kristin and our conversation with Shane to let you raise your voice. So you raise your hand in there, and then we turn your microphone live and get you talking. If you've been around for all these weeks, you know, we've mentioned that we're going to turn this curriculum that we've been doing in these 4 weeks into additional curriculum for people to use in their communities and in other places. And we're going to start tonight's session, like we have the other 3, with a reminder of what happened on January 6th. That on January 6th, people who wanted to stop the certification of a presidential election in the United States were sent at the urging of not only the President of the United States, but by many people in Christian communities to walk into the Capitol and to violently take over that space, to attack police officers, to break windows, to break in. The prayer that we're going to hear prayed here is one that was recorded inside of the Senate chamber. These are not only some of the people most memorable from the insurrection at the Capitol and that deadly event, but they're also people who really represent what this Christian nationalism looks like and sounds like and what it will do. And we're playing this each week because we're reminded that these are not far gone issues. These are not issues that just sit in small spaces. These are issues that show up in the most dangerous times in our society, and not just on January 6th. We'll talk about that as we go. Our theme tonight is de-radicalization. What can we do to help de-radicalize individuals and communities if they feel they've fallen into this? So here it is again. If this is new to you, I'll just tell you it can be a little shocking. And this is the prayer of the insurrectionists in the United States Capitol in the Senate chamber.
Hey, Doug, we're not able to hear it.
You can't hear it.
Thank you, Heavenly Father.
Mary Beth, can you hear that?
Yeah.
Thank you. Let me take it back.
Yes, you can hear it?
Yep.
Amen. For this opportunity to stand up for our God-given unalienable rights. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for giving the inspiration needed to these police officers to allow us into the building, to allow us to exercise our rights, to allow us to send a message to all the tyrants, the communists, and the globalists, that this is our nation, not theirs. Yes. That we will not allow the American way of the United States of America to go down. Thank you, divine, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent Creator God, for filling this chamber with your white light of love, with your white light of harmony. Thank you for filling this chamber with patriots that love you and that love Christ. Yes. Thank you, divine, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent Creator God, for blessing each and every one of us here and now. Thank you, divine Creator God, for surrounding and filling us with your divine, omnipresent white light of love, protection, peace, and harmony. Thank you for allowing the United States of America to be reborn. Thank you for allowing us to get rid of the communists, the globalists, and the traitors within our government. We love you and we thank you. In Christ's holy name we pray. Amen.
You know, we have been watching that for these last 4 weeks, and it is still tonight as disturbing to me as the first time that I saw it just days after the insurrection. Christy, Stephany, any responses from either of you after having seen it now again and again?
work, and I'm just like, what God are you referencing?
Yeah, I feel very similar. Kristy?
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar. Just it's hard every time. I expected by this time it would start to be, I'd be numb to it, but it's awful every time.
Yeah. Kristin, thanks for being with us tonight. Thank you for your book. We'll talk a bit about that. But do you have any responses to that video? Is that something you have seen before? Do you have any feedback for that?
Yeah, when I see that, when I hear those words in that space, I think a couple of things. On the one hand, that is a kind of fringe group, right? These are the insurrectionists, the ones who did storm into the Capitol violently. But then I always, as a historian, I'm looking at connections between the extremes and the mainstream. And that's where I'm actually most alarmed, because when I hear some of that rhetoric, when I hear, a talk of the communists and the globalists, and as Stephany said too, thanking God for bringing them into that space. And that's the kind of language, the kind of rhetoric that is not all that uncommon. So even if the actions might be on the extreme, and that rhetoric finds a home within a much wider swath of American Christianity. And that's something that concerns me.
Yeah. Well, Kristin, you have written this book, Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation, long before January 6th. And you were concerned about issues that were manifest on that day and have been a part of this country for a long time. Will you just say a bit about the writing of this book, where it came from, and give people a bit of context about your own insider understanding of Christian nationalism and its threat in our society?
Sure. I actually began the research for this book more than 15 years ago. And it was at that point that I became intrigued by the connections between a kind of ideal of Christian masculinity, a very militant ideal that was all over the place in evangelical popular culture back in the early 2000s. So books like John Eldredge's Wild at Heart, God is warrior God, and every man is made in his image. Every man has a battle to fight. So it's also in the early 2000s kind of the heyday of Mark Driscoll and his very misogynistic and militaristic brand of evangelicalism that was really influential. And this was also the time of the early years of the Iraq War, when we saw survey data showing how white evangelicals were far and away more supportive of that war, of preemptive war in general, more likely to condone the use of torture, to embrace aggressive foreign policy. And so at that point already, I started to ask, what might one have to do with the other? On this vision of a militant Christian masculinity, which also ended up presenting a kind of militant view of Jesus Christ himself, that Jesus was transformed into this militant warrior. And so Christians were to follow Christ into battle. Yeah. So this was a long time ago, right? And I actually set the project aside for a time because I had a real hard time discerning, is this a fringe movement because it felt so extreme, or is this mainstream? And so it really wasn't until the fall of 2016 that I picked it back up, because I started to see that many of these elements, this rhetoric, this language of militancy, of fighting to protect Christianity and protect Christian America, was much more mainstream than I had ever imagined it to be.
Do you have a sense that something is different even now? I've been using the metaphor in my own thinking from the coronavirus, of them talking about these variants, that we get these different variants from different places, and it moves differently and is more contagious, or isn't maybe as affected by certain treatments or the like, that there's a certain kind of Christian nationalism that's now on the scene and it's maybe 5 or 6 years old. Does that seem right to you in the study that you've done? Are we in a particular variant of this thing right now?
I think that is true. On the one hand, you can look back to history and you can see a much longer narrative where you do have this embrace of militant that Christianity, culture wars, Christianity, going back to the Cold War, this militant defense of Christian America. We can talk about race too, that this is connections between a white Christian nationalism here. This is very much, Christian nationalism is a white racial identity. As it manifests in the United States in the last half century or so. So you have all of these strands that do go far back in time. But it does seem like the last few years have brought it out into the open to an extent that it hadn't been before. And so what we see then is, and this corresponds with the kind of the rise of Donald Trump as first as candidate and then as president, where Trump would say things that many Christians didn't feel they could say, and many conservative Christians were actually drawn to Trump because he was so ruthless, because he could be crass, because he was not restrained by Christian virtue or even the democratic norms or basic civility. So he was this warrior who could fight for them in a way that, nobody from among their own ranks really could do. And so they really admired that in him. And so when he was crass, when he was belligerent, when he, those were actually attributes as far as many conservative evangelicals were concerned, because it just demonstrated that he would be ruthless and do what needed to be done. And I think that has in some ways kind of rubbed off, that people have been inspired by that model now, not needing to kind of cover militancy with a veneer of Christian niceness, just to kind of embrace this this reality. And Trump's success then with white evangelicals, I think, has inspired other would-be leaders to try to mimic that and to try to kind of capture this next wave of evangelical loyalty, evangelical support. So I do think we are in a new space today. Also just seeing the effects of this, the kind of blatant racism around Build a Wall and around Black Lives Matter, resistance to Black Lives Matter, that has really come to the fore. And many conservative white evangelicals in particular, have sided with racism, have sided against addressing systemic racism, and so I think that has again just made things visible that maybe were always there, but by making them visible, I think it has strengthened them.
Can you speak a little bit, like just going further into the conversation on variance? The work that you present is very masculine in theory and study and all of that. But I am thinking about the rise of the Marjorie Taylor Greens and Lauren Boeberts and others. Can you speak to how women are participating in white Christian nationalism?
Yeah. So historically, this kind of militant, rugged Christian masculinity was contrasted to more sweet, submissive femininity. Now, not that you had to choose one or the other, of course. You just embodied one or the other if you were a man or if you were a woman. And so they actually fit hand in hand, right? This sweet, gentler Christianity needed the ruthless protection of the masculine warrior, right? So they've always fit hand in hand. What we see changing, though, and I think we can really date this further back, certainly to Sarah Palin, who was a kind of harbinger of what was to come, in the sense that she, in many ways, fit this ideal kind of feminine model. She was a former beauty queen. She was a mother of several children, soccer mom, all of that. And at the same time, Pentecostal, and, she just really down home. But she could also really just prop up this ideology, prop up Christian nationalism, the whole conservative playbook in a way that she was intentionally trying to put liberal men to shame. Like she coming after Barack Obama, challenging his masculinity. So basically hey, if you liberal guys aren't going to stand up and protect this country, then, leave it to us. We'll step in and we'll put you to shame, and we have our guns, and we aren't afraid to say what needs to be said and do what needs to be done. And so I think more recently, we're seeing a number of women step into this space, but they inhabit that space somewhat differently. So they're very pro-gun. And they can be aggressive in their rhetoric, but they still have this kind of femininity that they carry with them, right? Beauty is still very important, very much a part of this. You can see this across kind of Republican femininity, certain hairstyle, lots of makeup, certain way of dressing. And so they're able to, in some ways, combine the traditional Christian femininity with this more aggressive militancy in a way that I think is sometimes difficult for liberals or for progressives to fend off. It's one thing if you've got somebody like Donald Trump that you're taking on, but if you have a woman, kind of making the same arguments, I think it kind of throws them off a little bit more. But that does seem to be the kind of new brand.
Mm-hmm. So, as a historian, and using your lens as a historian, what do you think is next? I mean, is there any way to kind of predict what this looks like moving forward? Does it continue to grow? Is it going to crash and burn?
Yeah, as a historian,
it's so disturbing. It's so disturbing. I think, like you said, so many people that I think have maybe had these views but they were inside, and now they're just blatantly out with it, and it's really hard to listen to. It's hard to watch. You see people and you think, I thought I knew you, but maybe I didn't. It's just so hard. And it does seem to be this emboldening around each other when they're in those spaces. And then you have social media echo chambers and now their own news media to feed these narratives. It scares me a little bit to think about what could be ahead.
Yeah, you named all of the factors here, right? The echo chambers, the news media. A lot of conservative Christians have preferred their own media sources for a long time now. And so there's nothing entirely new about that. But social media not only reinforces echo chambers, but it also lets some of us kind of in on what's going on in those spaces too, right? And so it's kind of hard to hide. If you didn't tune into Christian radio, you just wouldn't hear what was being said on Christian radio or talk radio or so on. And now, you see it on your friends or your family's Facebook page. And so it's harder to ignore. So I think we're more aware of these differences in some ways right now. But I think they are more harshly expressed as well, again, especially around issues of race, but really across the board. And certainly in terms of, I think, democratic norms, which is, talking about this kind of new variant. I think that kind of a challenge to our democratic norms and institutions is much more prominent now than it was a few years back, much more visible at least. So where are we going next? It's really hard to say because, it's always hard to say because things happen that you don't expect. And, it can we can veer off in many different directions. History will demonstrate that you never really know what's right around the corner. But what I'm seeing right now, a couple of different things. This rift is real, right? It's real. It's cutting through families. It's cutting through communities, through churches, that people who thought they shared the same faith are now looking at each other across this chasm saying, who are you, right? And how can you say these things? And realizing maybe that similar religious language has papered over these really incredible differences for a long time, and that just can't be ignored. So what we see happening is, I think Ed Setzer called it the evangelical reckoning, where we do see a number of evangelicals saying, no, this is not my faith. This is not, and now that I see it clearly, we need to talk. This is not my Christianity. This is not my gospel. This is not my Jesus, right? And this is not my country. And so trying to change that, to stand out against it. And we see a lot of people leaving churches. We see people, some pastors getting fired, employees of Christian organizations either getting forced out or just walking away. That is very real and it's happening. So the evangelical reckoning is happening on an individual level. What I also see is it's not happening much at all on an institutional level. And so when you have individuals leave organizations, leave churches, when you have Beth Moore leave the SBC, and this is being repeated on the local level all over the country right now, just, enough is enough, or you get fired. Who remains, right? The people who remain are often more radicalized. The voices of dissent are removed, and they can go on with what they're doing. And so I see both of those dynamics at play right now. A number of people who had kept quiet for a very long time, who had been complicit in many ways in allowing things to get to where we are now, are saying enough is enough. And there are all kinds of individual acts of courage. And at the same time, I see that institutions are really persisting in these spaces, and in some ways, radicalizing. And so I'm not really optimistic at this point. The one other thing I think that has changed significantly is, Donald Trump is no longer in the White House. And that, I think, is hugely important, because the real attraction there was power. Right? Power to protect Christianity, power to protect Christian America. And as soon as Donald Trump is no longer in the Oval Office, he does not wield that kind of power anymore, right? He's not the leader of the free world. He doesn't even have a Twitter account at this point. And I think that makes a real difference. It really does. Now, it doesn't mean that what's around the corner next, but I think the longer that he's in this diminished space, perhaps the better. And I know people are competing to kind of get out in front of this, next wave. And, Ted Cruz tried at CPAC, and that didn't go over all that well. And others are trying to position themselves. But I don't really see that charismatic leader stepping out, which is what we had for the last 4 years. And I think that's just worth acknowledging. And it's hard to know what's next on that front.
Kristin, you had this really amazing article recently where you talked about people who are kind of caught in these institutions and struggling with what to say. Should I just leave, or they get fired? And you had kind of this challenge where you were encouraging people to leave loudly. And I wonder if you can just say more about that, because I know a lot of our viewers tonight may be struggling with that right now.
Yeah. So I was actually talking about Jemar Tisby's call to leave loud. And Jemar Tisby modeled this himself and talked about his own departure from white evangelical spaces, and talked about many African Americans have been making those choices in African American pastors leaving the SBC, African American religious leaders who had really ministered in these predominantly white spaces in recent years and in recent months. Many are saying enough is enough. And what Jemar called on people to do was, when you leave, to leave loud. To say what you're doing and why you're doing it, because there's been a lot of kind of a quiet exodus. I think the New York Times actually pulled an article on this, the quiet exodus of African Americans from white evangelical spaces. And it was time to leave loud, right? To make this visible, to hold white evangelical communities up, to account. And so in the piece, I discussed that, and then I also talked about staying loud. Right, because every decision is different. Every situation is unique. And since I wrote Jesus and John Wayne, I've received just so many hundreds of letters from evangelicals, predominantly white evangelicals, navigating these spaces and asking this now what question, acknowledging that they have been complicit in this. Now they're able to see clearly, and they're horrified, and now they're making choices of what do they do next. And for some, the choice is to leave, and for some, that's the right choice. But again, if everybody leaves, that just these institutions and these power structures remain unchanged, if not radicalized. And so another option is to stay, but to stay loud. And there's been such pressure in evangelical circles for a long time to be nice, to be deferential. Right, always to be deferential to those in authority, to the pastor, to the leader, to whoever has power, and to not disrupt the ministry, the witness of the church. Right, there's this rhetoric that is used to stifle dissent and to protect the status quo and to defend those who are wielding power. And at times it can take really abusive forms. And that's something I write about in the book as well. Abusive power and sexual abuse in evangelical organizations. And it's not just the perpetrators that are horrifying, but the communities that end up protecting and enabling the perpetrators of these abuses, right? And so evangelicals have long been kind of indoctrinated into behaviors of do not disrupt, protect the brand, protect the witness. And so I think that that has really gotten us to where we are now. And so a different tactic is appropriate, and that is to voice your dissent and to repeatedly voice your dissent and to continue to challenge the power structures, to continue to speak out for victims, to speak out for the oppressed, and to hold leaders to account. And you're going to feel rude doing it, and it's going to be really uncomfortable, and you're going to lose friends when you do it. But you're going to find other friends as well. And I think that's the dynamic that I see happening. So some people are leaving. If you leave, you got to leave loud. And if you stay, you also have to stay loud.
That, in a sense, protects the church and faith. What advice do we have, though, like politically, socially, in the the electorate? Because it seems as if Christian nationals are getting exactly what they want. They don't want you in the congregation, and they definitely don't want us in the nation as well.
Yeah, so Christian nationalism really, perpetuates this us versus them mentality. It sounds like, oh, Christian America, we're talking about everybody, but of course we're not, right? We're talking about just a distinct kind of swath of Christian Americans and of white Christian Americans, or people who think just like we do. And so it's not a kind of unifying narrative by any stretch. And so that's when it comes to into conflict with democratic norms and ideals, right? Because who do you want in charge of this country? Who has a right to be in charge of this country? If this country is, according to the myth, founded as a Christian nation in a way that looks just like conservative evangelicalism today, and historians have really worked to dismantle this for decades now, this kind of myth of Christian America. But if you hold on to that myth, then the rightful heirs to that founding are conservative evangelicals, and not secularists, or not non-Christians, or even not progressive Christians, right? They're people who hold the same values that we do, that we've projected onto the American past. And so there is a dynamic of wanting to suppress the influence of those who do not hold these values, whether it's voter suppression, and again this goes back decades, right? And we can talk about how opposition to the civil rights movement was key to mobilizing conservative evangelicals back in the 60s and 70s, opposition to desegregation. That is part of the heritage here. And, up to today, the idea of the ends will justify the means. That's something I ran up against a lot in my research. The idea that, God is on our side, our cause is righteous. But the enemies, the threats are so great, the threats to Christian America, that again, it takes a tough guy. It takes an ultimate fighting champion. It takes somebody who will bend the rules, right? Or throw them out the window, because again, the threats are just so dire. And so that can justify all sorts of, not just kind of cruel rhetoric, but, really anti-democratic impulses. So suppressing the vote, just many examples of bending the rules, playing dirty, because if God is on your side and if you're working for the good, it's all going to be justified in the end.
Kristin, I know you're not able to see the comments there. But you've sort of nailed so many of the comments that people have been asking. So I think you're right on the money with where people are. And one of the comments that Alexandra O'Brien makes is just a reminder that for her as a Catholic, she also sees this in the Catholic Church. And while it's certainly one of the telltale signs for certain kinds of evangelicals, it's not just an evangelical thing in this country, right? It's a Catholic thing. It shows up in across the mainline traditions and denominations. It's actually alive and well with people who don't have any religious affiliation at all, which is one of the shocking things that I have come to learn. I wonder what your thoughts are on that the Christian nationalism is often highly perpetuated by people that have no religious connection or community or personal faith, right? It's actually replaced a personal faith or their own commitment to a community. It's not Christian. We've been reminded of this week after week. But do you have thoughts about that? That it's how it is sort of sprinkled throughout the culture and not only inside of certain subcultures?
Oh, definitely. So, in my book, I look at how this Christian nationalism is perpetuated through popular culture and through Christian popular culture, evangelical popular culture, but also intersecting just with secular culture. I mean, the title of the book suggests as much. Jesus and John Wayne. John Wayne was not an evangelical, but evangelicals are inspired by this, John Wayne masculinity, turn it into a view of quote unquote Christian manhood. But then these values of this kind of militant, conservative, iconic, traditional masculinity, the John Wayne masculinity, ends up uniting conservative evangelicals with secular conservatives, right? They hold these same cultural values. And that's why in my book, I talk about not just, kind of evangelical organizations and theologians, but I also talk about Duck Dynasty as this kind of point of, red state Americans and conservative evangelicals really coming together and united around this cultural ideal, this cultural identity, really. And because it's conveyed through popular culture so much, yes, you can be immersed in this without attending an evangelical church. You can be immersed in this as part of the mainline. This popular literature and popular culture is not restricted to any denomination. It's not restricted to any church, right? It just spills out. It crosses boundaries. Just ask our Canadian friends, and it actually has spread across global Christianity. This iteration of American, Christian nationalism is taking root around the world right now, and then in Catholicism as well. Here you see, I've talked with a number of Catholic scholars to try to get a sense for the lay of the land, because from what I can tell, we kind of end up in the same place. And there's a lot of unity at the top. So in terms of political alliances, right, the religious right has brought Catholics and Protestants together for half a century now. But the popular culture seems somewhat separate still. And so Catholics will have their own radio stations, they'll have their own literature, and they'll have kind of their own variants of this, where we end up in the same place, increasingly, I think, sharing this common cultural identity that then unites conservative evangelicals, conservative Catholics, and secular conservatives. So they find much more in common with each other than they do with people of their same faith who hold different political views or cultural ideals.
And I would argue that it's not just conservatives, right? That it might be more in our face and easier to blame conservatives, but I am thinking of prior conversations that we've had here in the Vote Common Good forum around Bruce Springsteen and his Super Bowl ad, right? And just the centering of Christian nationalism, even from who we perceive as progressive and liberal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that somehow has now come to define what is real America, right? What is authentic, genuine America, and that's what we need to unite around, rather than seeing that as something that really ends up dividing Americans one from another.
Hey, Kristin, it seems to me that most people don't identify themselves as Christian nationalists. Like, I don't know if you did a poll, and we had, some people on a couple of weeks ago, Sam and Andrew, who actually did this polling and looked at the polling. People don't use it as a self-identifier. There's other things they do that they use to identify, and that people can notice to see if someone's expressing Christian nationalism in relationships or in a church or in a job interview or listening to a sermon from a neighborhood or area pastor. But Christian nationalism as a reality, even if someone doesn't call it that, it must serve people in some way, right? Like, it has some function. It's not just an accidental state of belief and they kind of have it wrong, or it's some misinformation that they got and you need to run around and correct everyone from getting it wrong. This notion of Christian nationalism and someone's personal holding to it, it functions in their life in some way that they think is better than not having it, right? Do you have a sense of what that is? Because it's easy for a lot of us, and we've spent 4 weeks and we'll continue to talk about the threats of Christian nationalism, and we will talk about the weaknesses of it, and we'll talk about how it's inconsistent with Christianity, it's inconsistent with the American history and our current American imagination, all the problems. But it functions for people in some way that they don't want to let go of it. Do you have a sense of what that is for the people who don't even know that they're a Christian nationalist? Like, what is it that they're holding on to that ultimately lands them in that spot?
You're absolutely right that most people do not identify as Christian nationalists. It's just not a term. It's a term that scholars or observers will use to describe this phenomenon. But it's also, I think there's a more pernicious explanation. And it's that these ideals are so pervasive in certain pockets of American Christianity that it is simply Christianity to the people who hold it, right? That they're unable to separate this Christian nationalism from what they perceive simply to be Christianity, faithful biblical Christianity. So, they might not identify as Christian nationalists, but try to move the American flag away from the front of their sanctuary. Or the way that the 4th of July or Memorial Day are celebrated as these kind of sacred holidays. Or even one of my favorite things to do is, walk into Hobby Lobby, evangelical retailer, right? And see all of the blatant Christian nationalist home decor that you can buy and put on your walls. I do this regularly and I take a lot of pictures. But again, this is just Christianity. This is who Christians are. It's the air they breathe. And so outside observers can say, whoa, look at that. When you're on the inside, this is, for many people, this is how they've been raised. This is what is preached from their pulpits. This is what their family members hold to, right? And so it is just generic Christianity to them. And good Christians love their country, right? God bless America. That is just, so you have to, it's hard to start to kind of undo this. What does it do for people then? Why do they still want to cling to it? It gets to the heart of personal identity, I think. It also, I think, is very affirming for people who embrace Christian nationalism, because it places you kind of at the center of a really heroic narrative. And it gives you an important role. You are, first of all, you belong, right? You belong. This is your country. And it always has been. And even if you feel marginalized, and even if you feel like disempowered, you know that somehow rightfully this country still belongs to you. And you want to, there's so much language historically that I ran into around restore Christian America. We need to restore this. We need to reclaim Christian America. And then, more recently we got the Make America Great Again version. But this idea that it's yours to reclaim. And I think there's something really empowering in that, of placing yourself at the rightful center of things. And then any time you feel marginalized, you can be aggrieved, rather than saying, maybe I'm not at the center of the story right now, or maybe I need to decenter myself. Or maybe the story in which I locate myself is not one of unalloyed heroism and something to be celebrated, but maybe there's something to lament. Maybe there's something that I need to change. Maybe there are injustices that I do carry some responsibility for. That's not a celebratory. That doesn't feel quite so good, maybe it doesn't seem like it would feel quite so good. I don't know, because when I think there's a misperception sometimes. You hear a lot of rhetoric about white guilt, or about just how Trump would talk about this too, in terms of you need to celebrate our heroes. He wanted to have a garden of heroes, and forget about all this negative stuff. We don't want the 1619 Project. We want the 1776 Commission, and just celebrate all the good stuff that mostly white Christian men have done, right? That's what we need to be doing. This idea that it's really depressing to dwell on the darker side of history. When in fact, I would say that the people I know who are dwelling on that darker side, who are working for justice, many of them are doing that with great joy, right? And finding strength in community. And we have this model in the civil rights movement of beloved community. And so I think there's a misperception on the part of conservatives who feel like it's all darkness and gloom and, guilt. And you want to hold on to what's yours because it seems scary on the other side. When in reality, I think many of the people who are working to, out of a more, say, prophetic Christian nationalism, perhaps, of, well, let's bring our country to its potential. Let's work to rectify the things that we didn't get right. Let's address the hypocrisies. Let's take this language of equality and rights seriously. And what would that look like? That this isn't just a dour movement where it's just guilt. It's actually a source of joy and inspiration and working in community with people across differences. So I think that there's just some fear in losing an identity that people have cherished and not knowing what's on the other side of that.
We have a few other questions for you, but I'm just going to mention to the people in Zoom that if they want to raise their hand by clicking that little button on the bottom that says raise hand, that'll let us know that you want to ask a question with your microphone. We'll turn on your microphone, Kristin or Stephany or Christy, or I will be able to hear your question and or your comment. So if you want to do that, go ahead and raise your hand, and then Mary Beth will let us know that there's some hands up. But Stephany or Christy, did you have another thought for Kristin?
Just in what you were just saying, Kristin, like I especially see this in mom groups where, at least in West Michigan, if especially I think a woman talks about injustice or something, there's this, don't be so negative. Why are you being so negative? Look, like just God is good and we have so much. And, and this is the moms with the hair and the makeup and, it's these moms. And I wonder, even especially if a woman talking about those things is supposed to be off limits, like that's the men's work. We just cheery and be happy and keep a happy house. And but yeah, just an observation after what you said, that this is a thing.
Yeah, the hashtag blessed idea. And that really has been marketed to Christian women for a long time, this kind of consumer Christianity and, things are great and really look out for your own family, focus on your family and your own children, your own prosperity, and then thank God for all those blessings. And, it is, and you call it Christianity, right? And this is kind of what goes for Christianity, and it seems sweet and it seems gentle and it seems just not at all disruptive. And disruptions are what is a danger to this, right? And so you want to tamp those down. People who are challenging the status quo. Those are the people that are often removed from their presence. And I see this dynamic often. I've experienced this dynamic I'm also a West Michigan mom, and it's I think it's a reality that there's a kind of code there of what of really protecting the status quo.
And to speak anything different would be a part of this cancel culture, right? To speak anything of truth, to speak anything of justice and accountability is, you just want to cancel me. You don't want me to be, who I am as a person.
Yeah, that's become a really effective weapon, the allegation of cancel culture. Just like, it's really changing the meaning of social justice in certain conservative communities, that really just happened over the last few years. They used to be able to talk across some difference, political, cultural differences within Christian circles by saying, hey, let's talk about justice. Let's talk about social justice. Let's talk about shalom. Let's talk about some of these things. And that's been, kind of weaponized cancel culture now. And so, these are tactics that are incredibly effective to keep us from talking honestly and openly with each other across these differences. And it can make conversations extremely difficult. But there's also, there's a lot at stake because, there's wealth here, there's privilege, there's status, and there's comfort. And, challenging any of these things or all of these things should be expected to produce a bit of a response, right? A bit of backlash. And I think that some of that is just inevitable because people don't want to. None of us, right? None of us want to change our or give up our identity or frankly be criticized, right? None of us really like that. So we definitely need healthier spaces where we can have these conversations and really resist this kind of weaponized language.
We have a question here from Mary. And Mary, so glad that you're with us again tonight. Mary, you have a question or comment for Kristin?
Yeah, I guess you can't see the chat. I was interested to know if you've looked as a historian at the Reformation and looked at the work that, for instance, Phyllis Tickle did in 2012, in which she outlined for us the possibility that we are in this 500-year Reformation right now as a Christian body, and gave some framework, and it's got to work itself out. And in the midst of us, you, me, historically present at this moment, it's hard for us to see where it will end any more than it did. Like for me, I'm an Episcopalian, Anglican, and the English church was literally people killing each other over whether to be Protestant or Catholic, and they wanted both, and they ended up more or less creating a both and way, which is a really difficult balancing act. And now we're in another Reformation, and I just wonder if you have a historical plus how we live into that. Does that bring comfort? It did me, in a sense, to say, I'm not going crazy. This is happening around me.
Yeah, I am a Reformed Christian myself, so I grew up celebrating the Reformation, celebrating Reformation Day every year. And so there's something kind of inspiring about that comparison. And yeah, comforting in some ways, because it's okay to disagree, and it can be a very healthy thing for the church, right, to be disrupted like this. I would also say that, to put it on par with the Reformation might end up centering what is largely a white, at least right now, a white American tension, right? And so it does feel, for those of us who are in white Christian spaces in America, it feels incredibly disruptive right now. And at the same time, when I hear voices of despair, right, particularly from evangelicals who say, this is not my church, right? This is not what I meant. What is happening? And there's a lot of anguish right now. There's a lot of this reckoning of, have I been living a lie? I've been hearing from pastors saying, what have I done the last 35 years of my ministry? This is what I built. And now I see what it is, and I'm horrified by it, right? So there is this just incredible kind of sense of almost religious trauma, if you will, that I'm hearing from people. But that, I think, what I do then is I remind some of these people, that Christianity is not contained within white American Christian spaces or white evangelical spaces, because that's part of evangelicalism, kind of growing up with this notion that this is the fate of Christianity writ large rests with us, right? And so reminding people that Christianity is not collapsing just because their little corner of it might seem to be, it might need to be, but they can leave those spaces. And rather than, I have evangelical leaders saying, what can we do to reform? What can we do to rebuild? How can we change this? And it's an understandable question. It's a good question. At the same time, I do sometimes throw back the question of, is this yours to fix? If Christianity is actually flourishing outside of white evangelical spaces right now, maybe you should just go there. Right? Maybe you should go and actually just listen to people who are different from you. Maybe you should learn from other voices, from prophetic voices that are doing just fine and that have a long tradition of this kind of vibrant faith and living out that faith. And so, so yes, it feels when you're in these spaces like a dramatic reformation, and in a way that can be cathartic, and I think a way that can be good. But I would also want to contextualize that this is just a part of even just American Christianity, right? And to I think that's a healthy reminder, and that there's also real comfort in that. I think, right? It doesn't depend on us, on white Christians getting things just right. The fate of Christianity does not depend on it. I'm actually more concerned about the fate of American democracy. Frankly, I feel like the church will take care of it.
I feel the same thing. Well, Kristin, thank you so much for being so gracious with your time tonight and for being engaged in this way. We so appreciate it. Thanks. Thanks for being with us. We're now going to add in Shane Claiborne. Shane is a partner in a whole lot of work that a whole lot of us have done in a whole lot of spaces. Shane, you've been thinking about this for a long time. One of the questions that Mary, who read her question or spoke her question a little bit ago, raised in our first week, and we told her we were going to talk about it in a coming week, and I was waiting for you to reflect on this, is the intersection of American capitalism with American Christian nationalism, that those two things seem to be, if not, lovers, at least dance partners, that they're pretty deeply connected to each other, and that what's true of one becomes true of the other. So interested in all of your thoughts, but I really wondered if you would address that, sort of getting going here as a practitioner who's tried to help people make a move away from Christian nationalism into a deeper sense of faith and proper civic engagement.
Yeah, man. First of all, it's great to be with y'all, and I've been following these conversations. I love me some Kristin DuMez, so that was awesome. I read her book, and we did it as a book club at RLC, and everybody got into it. My sister-in-law, who goes to Franklin Graham's church, and then my father-in-law, who was like, I love John Wayne. We're like, grab the book. We're going to do it till we start doing it. So, when it comes to the this money thing, I think we got to begin by looking at the fact that we have "In God We Trust" on our money. I mean, I think it would be great if we said, "In God We Aspire to Trust," or something like that. But like, when you're having "God You Trust" on your money, when your economy looks like the 7 deadly sins, we have made this. We've just taken the Lord's name in vain, and we've kind of created this fusion of our faith and our economics. To where when Soren Kierkegaard said it well. He said, "Where everything is Christian, nothing is Christian." So we lose the very heart of the gospel. When Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor," in the gospel, in the Sermon on the Mount, that's not America's gospel. America says, "Blessed are you who work hard, and earn what you deserve. Blessed are the middle class, not the poor. Blessed are the merciful," Jesus says, and our country says, "Blessed are you who are proud to be an American." We're not blessing the peacemakers. We're blessing the liberators, the war makers. So I think all of that is kind of married in American. I think that's why we've separated individual salvation from the transformation of society, right? So like we're literally talking about who people are sleeping with in the evangelical church, while some of the most prominent evangelicals are in bed with Caesar, and sleeping with Uncle Sam, and have colluded that. So I think that's, we see that in our economy. As you look at Jesus saying, sell everything you have and give it to the poor, that's just very different from the American dream. And when we confuse the American dream with God's dream, that's where we get this kind of toxic cocktail of American nationalism.
What do you see as the way out or the detox? Separate but not. I watched the film The Social Dilemma this past week. And when we are thinking about the role and the impact and the effect of Christian nationalism, a lot of that also has to do with the rise in the emotional colonization through capitalism by social media, right? So you have algorithms that are now telling people how to think, feeding them how to think. What is the way out of, again, this conflation with just being with a lack of information, disinformation, and the truth of, quote unquote, and air quotes, the truth of the gospel not even being something that people can reckon with because they don't have access to it?
Yeah, well, Stephany, I think that the beginning of it is to identify this collusion of the religion, the heretical religion of American nationalism with Orthodox, authentic Christianity. And the fact is, in Jesus and John Wayne, Kristin does it so well. She shows us that, the problem is not that Americans think John Wayne is the Messiah. It's that they wish the Messiah looked a little bit more like John Wayne than the historical Jesus. We don't really want a cross. We've got a gun. And if Jesus had had a gun, he might not have gotten killed. I literally saw that on a bumper sticker with the flag, right? So I think that's where we've got to identify that the religion of American nationalism has its own theology, manifest destiny, the doctrine of discovery, right? The religion of America has its own liturgy, its own holidays, its high holy days, July 4th. It's got its own creeds. We hold these truths to be self-evident. It's got its icons and symbols, the flag, the national anthem is its worship song. And if you disrespect it, you're in trouble. So we've got to bounce all of that off of Jesus and off of the real gospel. And I think we literally have a choice. As Jesus said, we can't serve two masters. We've got to decide who we will serve.
Shane, one of the big questions a lot of people have raised, it's in the chat here tonight, it's been the driving question for people in every conversation that we've had in these 4 weeks, and that, other projects that I know you've been involved in, people have asked the same thing. And that is, hey, what can I do about the people in my life? What can I do about my friends, my family, my neighbors, the people I know are into this? What should I do? I heard Kristin saying tonight, just say something, say it loud and be clear and say something. You've been working at this for a long time. In my memory, for decades, you've been on this topic. Do you think it's possible to help someone who's rooted themselves in Christian nationalism and can't see the difference between Christian nationalism and Jesus following? Do you think it's possible for them to be freed from that by anything anyone else does? Or what do you think goes into someone ever awakening to that moment and being de-radicalized?
I don't just think that we can come out of it. I know we can, because I was a part of all that. I was immersed in it. I saw my faith fueling my political imagination, or vice versa. I helped organize the Bush Quail campaign. I was on the other side of so many of the issues that I feel passionately about. We believed that we were persecuted because we couldn't make the whole high school say the Lord's Prayer, and so that was our fight, So I think we need to, part of what gives me a little bit of grace and patience is looking back at who I was 25 years ago and wondering how much patience I would have for myself back then, Yeah. But I think that we have to counter the bad theology with good theology. And that's where I think the good news in all of this is the best corrective to what's gone wrong in Christian, evangelicalism is Jesus. And if we center Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, the things Jesus talked about, it is the best critique of America. I mean, you literally can't come up with much more of a counter American gospel than the Beatitudes of Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount. So, I mean, I think that's part of what we do, but we've got to challenge this idea that we gets confused in American nationalism, which is the vocation of the church and the mission of America, the kind of mythological mission of America, right? What is God's primary instrument for changing the world? And we just believe, we've always believed it's the church. And yet, like, there's this kind of counter narrative that Martin Luther King challenged, right? He said, don't let anybody make you think that America is God's messianic force in the world, the policeman of the whole world. So I think we've got to challenge that idea of American exceptionalism, right? That actually we're the city on the hill, where America is the center of God's redemptive plan for the world. And that's where we really got to push back.
So I know a lot of people who would agree with you, and they say, man, I got to combat bad theology with good theology. I just don't know if I know how to do that with my father-in-law. I don't know if I know how to say the right things to combat the bad theology that he's had for 75 years with the theology that I have. Any tips for people who are just doing, they don't feel like they can deconstruct all of that to provide a better story, and so they get quiet, right? I know just so many people have told me these stories. They're just like, I don't want to fight. I don't know how to do it. I'm not a theologian. I don't know what to do. Do you think are there things that individuals that don't see themselves as experts can do to help someone?
Well, a couple of things. One, I guess, is that I don't know too many people who have been argued into thinking differently. They lost a debate and they're like, wow, you know what? I'm going to get rid of all my guns. You're right. So I think that we've got to, sometimes the heart of our problem is not just a theological problem. It's a proximity problem, right? It's a relationship problem. And until immigrants have names and faces, until Black lives are humanized, and you see George Floyd, you see the videos, we know the names. Like, now racism is not just a debate, it's personal, it's hard to argue against. And so I think we've got to humanize the people who are suffering from the injustices. And, I don't think it's a coincidence that Jesus's powerful statement in Matthew 25, where we're separated based on how we care for the most vulnerable people. These are all about relationships, proximity. Did you visit me in prison? Did you welcome me when I was homeless or an immigrant? Did you care for me when I was sick? And so I think that proximity, that relationship to the people who Jesus named as the least of these, the most vulnerable people in our world, that makes all the difference in the world. If we're not near to those who are suffering, it's hard to have an urgency that the world needs to change. Until gun violence has some names and faces, it's hard to feel the fire in our bones to change it.
I want to push this point a little bit further, right? Because again, for the vast majority of us, we come at this from a Christian perspective, and we perceive that the idea of good theology exists, right? And that bad theology can be replaced with good theology, but at the end of the day, it's still Christianity and theology. What do we say to those in the ecosphere who are like, the problem is Christianity in and of itself tied to the function and the role of the nation?
Yeah, Stephany, that's good. And I guess when we're talking to the people who have Jesus, at the center of their framework, or at least, that's what we hope for. I think we can not do less Jesus, but do more Jesus, right? what did Jesus say about welcoming the stranger? What does that mean for how we welcome refugees? You know, what did Jesus say about loving our enemies? What does that mean for how we, you know, think about guns and war? So I think that centering Jesus is helpful. But I also think that, again, like, it's not just a head problem, it's a heart problem. And so sometimes our heads change when our hearts are moved. So we've got to find ways to move people in their hearts. And I mean, I think that's what Dr. King was trying to do. You know, what the civil rights movement did is they put it all out there. And, you know, Dr. King said, we've got to expose injustice so that it becomes so uncomfortable that people can't help but respond. Like, we've got to get in the streets. We've got to say the names. We've got to, you know, raise our voices so that it, you know, this becomes on everybody's radar. Because privilege is being able to choose, you know, which issues we care about and which issues we don't, and saying, I'm not going to care about this because it doesn't really affect me.
Shane, we have a question from Marjorie. Marjorie is in the Zoom meeting. And hey, Marjorie, you have a question or comment?
Yes, I would like to make a comment. I've been a Christian for 40 years and was really bought into a lot of this theology. And as I was coming out and questioning it, I got called a lot of really nasty names by Christians. And the thing that helped me deprogram from this was a constant prayer of, Jesus, will you still be there when I let go of this wrong theology? And I am so blessed because he's still there. And now I'm getting enough input of the good theology but it was like a grieving process almost, because I had bought into a lot of it. But that was my key, to know that when I let go of this stuff, Jesus would still be there.
Thank you, Marjorie.
Yeah.
Shane, any response?
Yeah,
or Kristin?
Marjorie. Sure.
Yeah, I was just gonna,
briefly. Go ahead.
That was my fault. I talked over all of you. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think, you know, like Kristin touched on, and what I've seen in so many people around us who do this, who it's very, very hard when you've been surrounded by a community who loves you and you love them, and suddenly they're kind of attacking you. But I think when you do start to emerge in a different way and lift your voice up in a different way and start speaking these things, you will find a whole new community of people that will surround you. And we hear that again and again, my husband and I in our ministry. So it's a really, really hard thing. You know, relationships get broken, families get split up. It's hard, but there are more people on the other end of it, I think, that will surround you and encourage you and walk with you.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, we can take some courage and some confidence from Jesus when he says, I mean, his harshest words were not for people at the fringes of the faith, but for the people at the center of the religious life, the religious elite, the teachers of the law. And he says to them, he calls them a brood of vipers, right? And he says, you're heaping heavy burdens on people. And he literally says that the tax collectors and the prostitutes are entering the kingdom ahead of you. Like, the people that you've excluded are actually coming into the kingdom of God ahead of you. So I think that, you know, that should give us a little perspective. And persecution is what we're promised if we remain faithful. And persecution is not having to wear a mask in public, right? Persecution. So yeah. Anyway, yeah.
Hey, we have one more comment here from Edward. Hey, Edward, thanks for being part of this tonight.
There, I'm unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we got you, babe.
Great. Yeah. So I really appreciate these conversations. And one of the things that I do diversity and inclusion training for my organization. And I really appreciate, you know, like the perspective that's been kind of had over these last conversations. But the question that was asked about what can we do to help convince people that have been engaged in these ideas strikes me as being a question that is mostly for white folks and not for people of color, or because I, as an evangelical myself and been even in mostly white evangelical communities, those communities are more oppressive to me, and these issues are more traumatizing to somebody like myself, and so I position myself in a place where I have to protect myself and my family, and leaving loud, as Jamar Tisby has said, becomes a priority more so than trying to convince my white brothers and sisters about the evils of these things. And so I'm just saying that we might need to consider the traumatization that BIPOC and ADOS people have when we think about Christian nationalism. So I'd like to hear you guys, talk about that.
Thank you. That's very insightful. Thoughts?
Absolutely. And every choice or battle that one engages in has to be a conscious decision and evaluation of what one is capable and willing to lose. I know, as an African-American woman myself doing this work, there are times where I'm just like, nah, I can't do it. And, and I have to speak that. I speak that even to our Vote Common Good collective and family, and say, like, I just don't have the capacity right now to do whiteness in the way that it's manifesting for my own health, for my own sanity. And we have to be very mindful of the kind of care that is necessary in the practice of this work. And it's not always our battle to fight, right? We can also lean back on the theology that the battle is not mine, it's the Lord's. And right now, y'all white people got to take care of yourselves.
Yeah, I love that. I appreciate that, Stephany. And I think this question's so important because, speaking as a white person, one of the things that we need to do, and this is crystal clear to me, is that we need to practice being a minority as white folks more often. We need to get out of spaces that are dominated by whiteness. And some of that might mean where we worship. It might be the organizations we're a part of, but we need to be in spaces. We might as well practice being a minority because it won't be that long before we are, right? And a lot of this is about the changing demographics of our country. And so we need to become comfortable in these spaces. And it's very clear that white folks and people of color are experiencing a very different America. Yeah. And we see that fault line around everything that we're talking about. Even the parallel tracks of the white evangelical church and the historic black church, the support for Trump, it was white evangelicals, and overwhelmingly women of color, people of color were standing against the policies and rhetoric of Trump. But, we talked about the Reformation, and part of what happened in the Reformation is we turned our back on the love affair with the Vatican and with Rome, and we married ourselves to the colonizing state power of white supremacy. And we put all of our chips in with that state power. So, I think we've got to get outside of that space as white folks. And the last thing that I'll say is I think we've got to, William Barber says, the way that we change the narrative is by changing the narrators, right? And white folks have colonized the airwaves. They've produced, if you look at the publishing houses, the Christian industrial complex is totally run, by white folks. Even, gospel albums, we separated white Christian music from, what's gospel music? Oh, well, that's Christian music by black people, so we've got to challenge that narrative, and we've got to change the fact that some of the loudest, most prominent voices representing Christianity have not been the most faithful or the most beautiful voices. And the way that we change that narrative is by changing the narrators.
Thank you, Shane Claiborne. And thanks to all of you who are committed to this conversation, not only tonight, but as we go forward. We're so proud at Vote Common Good to be part of this work with you and to do what we can to raise our voices, to share what we have to say, and try to include as many people as we can in that process. We're going to do what we can to keep this conversation going. While this 4-week webinar series is finishing, we're going to try to turn this into curriculum that you can use in bits and pieces, putting it taking it apart and putting it back together in ways that you can use it for groups, you can share it in social context, use it with family and friends, with other people. So we know that an hour and 15-minute webinar is not most people's primary way of thinking about new ideas, right? So we're going to do all that we can to take this content and to make it available. So we want you to feel like you're part of things with us at Vote Common Good. If you're not already on our email list, you're about to be now if you're in that Zoom meeting, but if you're watching online, go over to votecommongood.com and sign up to be on our email list so that we can stay in touch with you in all those other ways. And I promise you, we're going to email you 3 times a week. We really do, because we want you to feel like you're part of this community. And if that becomes irritating, we get it. Put us in the spam folder or unsubscribe, but we do it because we want you to feel like you're a part of a community. We're not just hitting you up. We're trying to move together in the world to try to make some changes and to try to not only be different in our political system and different in our faith system, but really finding different ways to be with one another. So thank you for being a part of all of this. Christy and Stephany, for your great co-hosting for all these weeks. I am so deeply appreciative. It's been just great. And I'm already feeling like we need to find a time to do all this stuff again. Shane, thanks for being around on our final segment here and having the last word. And to all of our guests through all of these weeks, it's really been wonderful. So we hope this has been beneficial to you. If you want to be part of what we do and you want to help us pay for all of this, go over to votecommongood.com and make a donation over there, and it'll, pay for all this magic to happen. We'd be glad to have you in as a contributor as well. So anybody else with a final word for us before we say goodnight on this, our 4th week?
I just want to say thank you for all who have stayed with us and those who have joined us at different points throughout this webinar. And again, it's just a pleasure to know that this content will live beyond these 4 weeks and will be available in ways that, again, to enlarge community. This is transformative movement work and not just a moment to tap into a webinar.
Yeah, and thank you, Doug, for organizing this, and just, all the speakers that we've had have been so helpful, and I feel like I've learned so much and have so much more to learn. So it's great, and it's great to know that there are all these other people learning with me out there. So
great.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always good to team up. I love being with y'all, and the evangelical in me would feel like I didn't quite say it. I should have said this, is that, for those that are deconstructing and leaving white evangelicalism, don't see that as the end of your faith, but maybe as the beginning. And, there's some good stuff happening. Don't allow the toxic version just to colonize our imagination. The landscape of what God's doing is much bigger than the ugly stuff.
Amen. Amen to that. Hey, one final note, people have been asking what we use for these graphics and all. It's a system called Ecamm. So if that's something interesting to you, that's how we do that. If you're finding yourself or your church online a lot, it might be something that you want to take a look at. And again, all this will be available to you in all the places where you saw this, also on our YouTube channel. And if you don't have enough already and you want a little more Stephany Spaulding in your life, tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Central Time, we lead an online podcast that goes out every day, and many of the same places where you would watch or see all of this are on all of our social channels as well. So, all right, good night to you all, and may we find a common good way to be with one another.